Then I do a presentation. For my own benefit, I like to start with this picture. It's one of my favorite places in Korea, and it says something about me also because it is far in the back of one of the famous Buddhist temples. I tend to scrounge around in the background of places and try to find places and information that other people may not find. I find this picture very calming, and so I put it up as also a chance for you to take a few deep breaths and just look at something pretty before we start with more information. Although, after all the wonderful things we've heard all morning, what I have to share with you is much more people-oriented than statistics. I don't know how to change. Do I need to change? What we're doing, that's who I am. I start out by being very honest. I am not a professor. I'm not associated with the university. I have been called an independent scholar because 2 of the books that I've written are used in university classes. And so the question often comes up, how did somebody like you get there? How did you go from there to here? And so I'll start, because even at lunch the question was raised, and if I don't tell you now, it will come up later, so let's just get it over with. Yes, I'm married to a Korean. That's how I got Kang as a last name. So people say, so you got interested in Korea because you married a Korean? And I say, no, it's the other way around. I already was studying Korean language. I already had a contract to go and teach in Korea when I met my husband. He, at the time, like all Koreans, planned to go back after he got his degree. The problem was he's a research scientist. When we went back in the early 60s, such jobs did not exist. His friends who were business majors went back and started companies, and they're the presidents of huge conglomerates now and very wealthy. We, on the other hand, are both teachers, and he's a research scientist, and so we just plugged along at this level. And it meant that there were no jobs in Korea. So one of my reasons for marrying him, and my family groans when I get to this point, I already had plans to go to Korea. My goal was to not live in an American community. I wanted to be immersed. My Korean is very poor. I have a very bad memory. I learn very slowly. So my plan was to go and live with Koreans. So I married a Korean, right, so I could live in a big Korean family. The trouble is, we moved to New York and spent 20 years in New York. However, during that time, we went back and forth as much as our budget would allow. One of the precious things to me is that my first times in Korea, most of the time was spent on a farm in Anyang, which at that time was Photo 1, which was all grape vineyards. And it was a very traditional farm, as I shared at lunch. Outhouse, no running water. I met grandfather at the well every morning, his very limited English and my very limited Korean, and even though I knew more Korean, somehow it got scared out of me. We would open our sliding doors, go outside, meet at the well, icy cold water, and grandfather would very traditionally say, "Good morning, Chanju's mother." Chanju's my daughter, who was a year old. And I would say in Korean, "Good morning, grandfather." And we were done then. That was our conversation. Until the next morning when we'd meet at the well again. But my interest in Korea, which probably started, I can remember being 13 and lying on the floor and reading maps. I loved the sound of Asian names, Colonial, Samarkand. I finally went to Samarkand a few years ago. And Korean names. And what fascinated me the most, and that came with the other picture, is the architecture. You never know what link is going to absolutely strike your soul. And the architecture of the palaces and the Buddhist temples just reached my soul right when I could just sit and absorb. And from there, all Korean architecture, the traditional homes, even the farm. Never mind the people or the history, just I fell in love with architecture. Okay, but I got to history. Sitting on the floor in the Korean farmhouse and listening to my father-in-law reminisce. And he would tell these wonderful stories. And the family sitting around would be chuckling. And he would tell stories of, in winter, making naengmyeon cold noodles up, and they lived almost on the border of North Korea. And he was a bank manager, so they moved around, but always in the very, very far north. So it's cold in winter, and you make the naengmyeon then. And they're made with, I don't know if you've seen this, they're in museums now, like a bellow, a huge, huge piece of wood and another piece of wood out to the pressing. And then you have a boiling fire here in a big pot and the noodle dough. And somebody has to press this down, and as he does, the dough goes through into the pot below. So my father-in-law would say it was his job to do the pressing down, but he was a very slight man, so he wasn't very strong. And in order to press that heavy piece of wood down, he would pick up one of his kids. And my husband says, "Oh, that's why you always held me over the fire." And so his family story used to, and that I knew a lot about the martyrs. And it wasn't until a few years later that I took grandfather's stories over here and colonial statistics over here, and one day my head said, "Oh, for heaven's sakes, they happened at the same time." How could they? How could these warm, wonderful stories have happened at the same time? And then I realized, when I thought that through, that's because nobody collected those kind of stories. The professors had done their research and had all the statistics. And the Koreans whose parents or grandparents had died knew about the martyrs. What about all the people in the middle who had survived? What are their stories? There's a writer, Barrington Moore, and he wrote a book on social justice. And when I was reading his book, the answer kind of fell into place. He has a place where he says, no matter the bad things that were going on, the common man knew that he was going to survive. He just had to sit tight and wait it out. If he joined the martyrs, he knew he and his family would suffer. So most of the people just sat tight and waited. And both my husband and I, by this time, said, well, somebody ought to catch those stories. And nobody was doing it. And I tend to get into that kind of thing. I want to read something. Most of the things I've learned, everything I have not ever taken a class. I hate to admit that I've never had a class in Korean studies, ever, from anybody. But I read a lot, and I listen when people are talking a lot. And then I find I want to know something, and I find nobody's written it. Bruce Cummings, at the beginning of one of his books, his little quote is, "This is something I wanted to read about, but I couldn't find it anywhere, so I had to write it myself." We had met a fellow in San Francisco who was very famous for what he'd gone through. And we actually thought, well, let's get started in this and see if we can do it by interviewing him. And so we made a date to interview him, and he's quite old, and he died the week before our scheduled interview. And when this happened, my husband and I looked at each other and said, okay, enough of this sitting around hoping somebody else will do it. We'd better get going. So we made this kind of a plan to find out what we could. All around the Bay, there are senior centers. Obviously, we needed to interview the people who were oldest. We wanted the ones who were adults under the Japanese. So that's from 1910 on. So are there any, who were the oldest people alive that we could find? And they would be coming on Saturdays for lunches such as we had to the senior centers around the Bay. So the biggest group was in San Francisco. So the plan was, there's no way that I could go, because these are old gentlemen. They grew up very traditionally. If a white guy walks in, or a white woman, they're not going to talk at all. So my husband also graduated from UC Berkeley, and UC Berkeley opens a lot of doors. So I said, okay, I will do all the writing. I had a number of published articles and things by then. I thought, I'm okay with the writing. I can do the organizing and the writing, but I can't get the interviews. So it was a division of labor, the outside labor and the inside labor. And my husband's plan was to go every Saturday over to the senior centers and interview, bring it home, and I would somehow turn it into a book. And then it became very interesting. I'd go over, and he'd sit around and have lunch to get comfortable so that they got used to seeing him. And he'd ask, what did you have stories from growing up under the Japanese? No, he'd come home week after week, nobody will talk. Nobody will talk, but I'll keep going, I'll keep making friends. Well, after a while, it was, I think I was recorder, and he'd call one man, sit in the other room and talk. And the fellow would say, oh, I haven't really thought about it because nobody ever asked me this before. Do you have grandparents around that must have a life and you've never bothered to ask them? Ask them while they're still here. One after another would say, it's been a long time. Haven't thought about it. Nobody asked me. He said, well, I'm asking you. So he'd start by, what school did you go to? Koreans love to talk about their parents and the grandparents. So instead of asking about themselves, he'd ask about the parents and the grandparents who were long gone and perhaps were even before the Japanese came in. But Koreans love to talk about them, so that would get them started, and then gradually would get to what happened to them. And as time went on, finally he'd come home chuckling one time, and he said, today when I went there, I barely got in. And an old fellow came up and pulled my sleeve and said, you haven't heard my story yet. And so that's how we gathered the interviews. With all the time it took, he would come home with maybe two, it was little tape recorders with the little cassettes. Maybe 2 hours of listening. And out of that 2 hours might come one short story. So volumes and volumes. We had, I think, 4 of the 3-inch binders, just full. And then my job, because it's all in Korean. So then we'd sit down. My Korean is not good enough to do it on my own. So we'd spend hours where he'd be reading and translating, and I'd be scrabbling out into English what it was, and then, oh, that looks good. Blah, 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 blah. Oh, that looks good. And then we found, the next step we found was, okay, take school stories. How was your schooling? We began to find that it was over maybe 2 years of collecting, the stories began to get repetitious. That school experience wasn't very different from that school experience. And then one would stand out. Well, on the ones that were similar, then we'd look for which storyteller had the most life in their story. The details were similar, but who told their story best? And I'd use that one. And then I had to figure out, okay, what to do with that. That's, now let's see. This has been sitting up here. Let's see what I can do. I can use that. And I have to measure my people. Okay, let's see what happens here. This is here. You're a high school teacher, so I don't need this. But I have spoken to, at times where someone asked a question about, like, Korea and Vietnam. Or in one case, it had nothing to do with this, but it was the gray robes of the Korean Buddhists. And a hand went up in the back and said, I think you've made a mistake. I think the robes are yellow. They are, wait, so this is just, we don't need that. The plan for today, very quickly. The what, why, and how we've already done. Historical background, my take on the historical background. is somewhat different. You'll be glad to hear what you've been having. This picture is of a family in the early 1900s, and it's in for a couple of reasons. Out of all the interviews, when we asked for pictures, two gentlemen had pictures for us. This one and one you'll see in a few minutes. Either, as in my husband's case, when he escaped from North Korea, his mother, he was only 12, and he packed his bag, and he packed it with the photo albums, and his mother said, no, leave the photo albums out. We need to take more important things. So mother took it out, he put them back in. And he almost made it with his photo albums, but his mom found him again. So no photos from North Korea. He was 12 when he left. Either that, or they lost all their pictures in the Korean War. So out of all, we ended up with 50 interviews. We interviewed probably twice that many, but we used 50. Out of all of them, we have 2 family photos. This is one of them. Here is my version of Korean history. And even this is exaggerated. The 3 dynasties that you've already heard of, and the little slot that is in Japanese time. I have to back up ever so quickly just to add. I can get. Okay, don't go there. Koreans being very upset about all the invasions and so forth. So under Koryo, yes, the Mongol invaded. I love the fact that it was under Kublai Khan. It makes it so personal. That you read about these guys and they're off somewhere. But their short story is that they wanted safety. The Mongols wanted safety on their eastern end, and so they arranged a wedding between a Korean princess and one of the Mongols, Kublai, or one of his relatives. Because the Mongol rule was you don't fight your in-laws. You fight the barbarians, but you don't fight your in-laws. So if they are, if the 2 countries are married, then you're in-law countries. They did a lot of destruction. They killed a lot of people. They ordered a lot of tribute, but they never took over the country. They never took over the administration. Same thing on Hideyoshi. He brought up from the south, but he never really took over. He didn't change the administration. It was only when you get to the Japanese that it changed the Koreans have this incredible angst over the Japanese time. The traditional division of the Japanese time is in 3 sets. I think in sets of 3. Somebody else said that. 3 parts, but then the important thing to me, the surprise for me, because part of my sharing with you today is insights, things that I learned, and if we have time, this was the first thing that I learned. Koreans are so upset if you start talking about the Japanese years. Right away, what comes up is we had to speak Japanese. We had to change our names to Japanese, and we had to work. And you think, I thought it was the whole since 1910. And look at the times there. 1938, 1939, 1940, change your name to Japanese. I had trouble comprehending that because the emotion with it is so strong. So that was my first insight. How strong an emotion can be in such a short of time. And this is my warning to you. You're all teachers, so you all know this. There's very little I need to say. The pictures on each side have nothing to do with anything except one is a bad picture, one is a good picture. And hopefully my book stands. I've been caught in this. I've had people write to me from Boston begging me to take one side or the other just because somehow I'm a semi-famous writer. Very semi. But my name gets around, so I get, please, will you add your name to this? And I say, no, I don't do that. And what's the point here? The warning is to you as teachers. If you end up teaching from this book at all, and you say the Japanese did good things, you're going to hear from the Korean parents. And if you say the other side, Japanese were so bad, you're going to hear from the Japanese parents. So if you teach from it, you have to find a way to face it, whatever works for you. It can be as easy as, hey, there's good and bad all the time, there it is. So that is my learning. I have a hand out for you. They're already out, that's great. All it is are these statistics, and I don't want to spend any time. But the statistics, if you look at the top and the bottom, in the late 1800s, there was something like 3,000 Japanese in Korea. Then by 1910, when they took over, it's 171,000, and by the end, 700,000. So you're getting flooded with the Japanese. The independence movement in 1919 was meant to be peaceful. And these statistics are from the Japanese newspaper, not the Korean. Even though it was supposed to be peaceful, 46,000 at least. I round everything off, I don't think well in numbers. 46,000 arrested, 7,000 killed, 15,000 injured. It was not peaceful. Somebody asked me once, well, what about the Japanese police? So from 7,000 to 45,000. The interesting thing about the police are the thought control. They were called the high police, but the Koreans called them the thought control. By the late time of the colonial times, they could arrest you if they thought you were thinking wrong, and you'll see that coming up if I think this picture is in the book, and I love it because it is the movement from traditional to modern. The gate is there, all the traditional farmer people around, and there's one of the first electric streetcars coming. And what I never noticed is there's two kids pushing it. I didn't notice that for a long time. If you look real close, I don't know. I don't understand that, but anyway, look closely and you'll see two kids pushing. Traditional school. And the Japanese were very pleased that they brought in modern school, which is not quite true because there were modern schools before that. A farming village to be, and you have it in the book, and I can't believe that the committee actually got a book for each of you. That's fantastic. So my insights, things that struck me the most. I was surprised by the name changes. I forgot to ask anybody when you want me to stop for 5 more minutes. And then hoped for goodness. I have readings for you, I won't have time for it, but it's in the book. What I did is pull those together. I'm going to show you the name changes. I have to quit. But surprised by mostly teachers who spent time. My husband had some not so good teachers. You couldn't complain. But there were teachers Japanese teachers who went out of their way. One teacher had 3 girls in a class of boys, and he went to the girls' home on bike every night to help them keep up with the fellas. One boss had when it came time for the Japanese to take what's the word? Koreans to be in the mines, in the shipyards, and so forth. This one fellow, when the Japanese police came to take him, his Japanese boss said, "No, you can't have him. I need him. He's essential to my business." And what it was, you know how firefighters have competitions about once a year who can put the ladder up the fastest and so forth. He always won those competitions. His boss liked having the winning, so he got it out of going to the shipyards. And then the expected, with the name of the book, The Black Umbrella. Somebody asked, the editor didn't want the name, he said, why is it called The Black Umbrella? There is no black umbrella. In my mind, it is that black cloud that hovered over Korea that said, your life may be good right now, but it can change. The best story is a fellow who was working in a restaurant, and a cat was bothering. His owner said, would you go out there with that cat? So in the night he goes out and he wrings the cat's neck and gets rid of him. The next day, chief of police comes, did you kill a cat last night? Well, yeah, that was my cat. I killed the cat. You killed the cat, now I'll kill you. Took him to the police station, had him kneel down, got a samurai sword, and really, he had no, the 20-year-old kid, he had no chance. The policeman raised the sword, and the fellow panicked, as we might, reached out and kicked his knees and then beat him on the face and then ran for his life and hid in the mountains, and he managed to stay alive, having beaten up a police chief. When it was all over and he was able to go back home, he found that he had actually blinded the man who had been sent home. But from a peaceful worker to killing a cat, to being almost beheaded by the police chief. My last one, then we'll go back to the name change. You know, they had to change the names. They didn't have to, it wasn't a law. But if you didn't, you couldn't go to school and you couldn't get a ration card. Your mail wouldn't be delivered, so people did. What fascinated me when I started actually collecting this is how hard they tried to keep their Korean name. And this is one example where on the side you can see that a family named Kim, these are various Kim families, and how hard they tried to keep the Kim. So as they moved into the same Kim, as you'll see as Kane in Japanese. And so you can see how Kanekuni, they kept the Kim and added country. So, you can read down. And then it's in the book. It's in the book in a very, the other one is how they didn't use the same name, but they kept the idea. I pulled out two examples here. The family name E has a tree on the top. And so the Matsumotos kept the tree, the idea of tree, and turned it into pine trees, because the pine trees reminded him of his home. Nobukawa is our Kang, and the Nobukawa has nothing to do with Kang, but the ancestral seat of Kang is Shin-chan. And so they simply said, Shin-chan, the two characters, if you say those in Japanese, it comes out Nobukawa. And so my husband went to school with the name of Nobukawa. And this idea of hanging on either to the actual name or to something that's important, we just saw over and over. And that was what surprised me. So as you go through the book, look for that. There's two charts. I had to put that in because it really struck me. Thank you so much for giving me the time to share and